Let me give you a number, not a theory, not a speculation, a number. In 1871, the city of Chicago burns. 3 days of fire, 17,000 buildings reduced to ash and rubble, a third of the city gone. The loss in today's money approaches $5 billion. It is one of the most catastrophic urban disasters in American history. And then something happens that nobody seems particularly interested in examining with any rigor. Within 15 years, on the same ground where that devastation occurred, on the ash, on the rubble, on the ruins of a city that had just been annihilated, there rises a building that changes the definition of what a building can be. 10 stories, steel skeleton, load-bearing ambition reaching skyward, the first skyscraper. Official birthday, 1885. Official father, William LeBaron Jenney. Official explanation, industrial ingenuity, American ambition, the heroic march of progress. Plain, satisfying, complete. Now let me give you another number, 47. That is the approximate number of years between the completion of the Home Insurance Building in 1885 and the completion of the Empire State Building in 1931. 47 years to go from 10 stories to 102. By any measure of technological development, that is breathtaking acceleration, remarkable, unprecedented in the history of construction. Except it isn't unprecedented, because here is the number that keeps me awake. Here is the number that the official story cannot comfortably absorb. From the moment the first skyscraper rises to the moment that cities across 6 separate continents are producing buildings of 15, 18, 20 stories, buildings of extraordinary ornamental complexity, buildings whose facades contain thousands of individually carved stone elements, whose ironwork defeats modern metallurgists who try to reverse engineer the joinery, from that moment to this global flowering of impossible construction. 15 years. Not 50, not 100, 15 years. The span of a single generation's working life. And you are asked to believe that in those 15 years from the ruins of a burned city, humanity simultaneously developed the engineering theory, the material science, the fabrication techniques, the logistical systems, the training pipelines, and the craft traditions necessary to erect these structures not in one city, not on one continent, but everywhere at once. I am not calling that impossible. I am asking you to actually sit inside it, feel its weight, because something in that number doesn't feel like progress, something in that number feels like inheritance. Let me establish something about what we're dealing with before I go any further, because this matters. I'm not talking about construction in the loose, impressionistic sense. I'm not talking about stacking blocks, mortaring bricks, building upward in the simple way that humans have always built upward. The buildings I'm describing require something categorically different. They require a mastery of structural steel that had not been industrially produced at scale before roughly the 1870s. They require an understanding of wind load distribution across rigid frames that belongs to an engineering discipline, structural engineering as a formal field, that didn't consolidate its foundational texts until the 1890s. They require foundation systems adequate to support tens of millions of pounds of material over the soft, alluvial, frequently waterlogged soil that underlies most major 19th century cities, soil conditions that should have made these buildings impossible by the standards of anything that had previously been attempted. They require all of this simultaneously, and they require it to work the first time. That last phrase, work the first time, I want you to sit with that. Because every technology in human history has a learning curve documented in failures. The Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903 because hundreds of experimenters before them crashed, burned, documented, iterated, crashed again. Steam power evolved through a century of exploding boilers, collapsed pistons, scalded engineers, each failure logged, studied, incrementally corrected. We have the receipts. The historical record of how hard it was to do something new is written in the blood, and the bankruptcy filings of everyone who tried and failed before someone succeeded. For the great building programs of the late 19th century, those receipts are astonishingly sparse. I don't mean the records are incomplete. Incomplete is a word for gaps, for lacunae, for missing documents that the historical record otherwise implies should exist. What I mean is something more specific, something more uncomfortable. I mean that where we look for evidence of struggle, for the buildings that tilted, for the facades that cracked mid-construction, for the steel frames that deflected beyond tolerance and had to be expensively corrected, what we find instead is a record of almost unbroken success. Buildings appear, they stand, they have always stood, and they are ornamented. God, are they ornamented. Stand in front of the Rookery building in Chicago sometime. Just stand there. Don't look at the photographs. Don't read the plaque. Just stand in front of it and look at the facade. Cast iron arabesques, terracotta medallions. A cornice line of such intricate elaboration, that if you tried to price it in today's labor market, skilled stone carvers, master iron fabricators, the specific subspecialty of artisans who carve acanthus leaves in 3/4 relief at 20 feet above street level with the precision of a surgeon, you would arrive at a number that would make the building's original $5 million construction cost look like a rounding error. They built that in 1888. Not they sketched it, not they planned it. They built it, in 2 years, with horse-drawn carts, hand-mixed mortar, and cranes powered by steam engines that broke down regularly in the Chicago winter. With a workforce whose members did not have smartphones to photograph their progress, laptops to coordinate the schedule, or digital fabrication tools to pre-produce the components to precise specification. And here's what the official record would have you believe: that the men who executed this, the carvers, the fabricators, the masons who laid the terracotta to tolerances tight enough that the building still stands plumb after 130 years, that those men either taught themselves or were trained in a matter of years by a rapidly expanding apprenticeship system that itself had to be built from scratch in a country that had been, 2 generations prior, a network of frontier settlements. That is the official explanation. And it doesn't hold. Not because it's internally inconsistent, it is internally consistent. It's internally consistent the way a stage illusion is internally consistent from the audience's perspective. Everything adds up. The woman goes in the box goes in the machine, the curtain drops and rises, and there she is unharmed, smiling in a different part of the theater. Everything adds up, except the one thing we're not being shown. The craftsmen who built the Rookery building didn't appear from nowhere. No skill that complex, no tradition that sophisticated, appears from nowhere. What appeared from nowhere, or what appears from nowhere when you examine the historical record, is the documentation of how they came to know what they knew. Now I want to take you somewhere, not a famous building, not Chicago or New York. I want to take you to Galveston, Texas, 1894, the United States National Bank building, classical revival, granite columns, ornamental bronze fixtures of extraordinary quality, carved limestone at every cornice and capital. Galveston in 1894 is not an architectural capital. It is not a city with deep craft traditions, long-established workshops, generations of trained artisans. It is a port city, 40 years old in any meaningful sense, sitting on a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico. By any reasonable assessment of where sophisticated architectural craft traditions are meant to flourish, Galveston is the wrong answer. And yet, or go to Louisville, Kentucky, or to Denver, Colorado, or to Savannah, Georgia. In each of these cities, in the same narrow window of roughly 1880 to 1905, buildings of extraordinary sophistication appear, not simple, functional commercial buildings, not the modest ambitions of a developing economy. Buildings with engaged columns, with rusticated base courses, with foliated capitals, with decorative programs of complexity and intentionality that imply access to a fully developed aesthetic and technical tradition. The official explanation here, and I want to credit the architectural historians who hold this explanation, because they are not stupid people, is the Beaux-Arts influence. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris was the dominant architectural institution of the 19th century. Architects from around the world trained there and brought its formal vocabulary home. Pattern books circulated, architectural journals published details, the formal language propagated. Yes, that's true, I believe that. The architects knew what they wanted to build. But the architects don't lay the stone, they don't carve the capitals, they don't fabricate the bronze, they produce drawings. And those drawings are executed by human hands whose skill cannot be transmitted through a pattern book. Where did those hands come from? I want to talk about Tartaria now, not because it's sensational, because it's the most honest way into a question that the official record refuses to ask directly. If you pull up a map, a real map, not a modern reconstruction, an original document from the 17th or 18th century produced by cartographers working under the auspices of European imperial powers, you will find, spanning from the eastern edge of Europe to the Pacific coast of Asia, a territory labeled with some variation of the name Tartaria. Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The nomenclature varies by cartographer and century. The territory itself, in its broadest formulations, encompasses something in the neighborhood of 10 million square miles, an area roughly 3 times the size of the United States. On those maps, it is not marked as unexplored wilderness. It is not marked as terra incognita. It is labeled as a territory, sometimes as a khanate, sometimes as something more ambiguous. Its cities are occasionally noted. Its major geographic features are recorded with the specificity of a region that European cartographers had genuine, if imperfect, intelligence about. And then, across the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it begins to disappear. Not overnight, not in a single administrative decision that left a paper trail we could follow. Gradually, the territory gets subdivided, absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire on one side and Chinese imperial administration on the other. The name Tartaria fades from formal usage. By the time the great building programs of the 1880s begin, it has largely ceased to appear on contemporary maps as a distinct political entity. The vast, sophisticated, poorly understood territory that occupied those 10 million square miles has been, in cartographic and official historical terms, quietly dissolved. I want to be precise about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there was a Tartarian empire with gleaming cities of impossible architecture that secretly built your local courthouse. The sensational version of this story is not the version I'm interested in. The sensational version offers false comfort because it replaces one incomplete explanation with another. It replaces we don't know with we do know, and it was Tartaria, and that substitution is intellectually dishonest. What I am saying is more specific and more uncomfortable. I am saying that whatever existed in that territory, whatever network of cities, craft traditions, knowledge systems, population centers, and accumulated technical expertise occupied 10 million square miles of Eurasia for centuries, is spectacularly underdocumented relative to its scale. And I am asking whether it is possible that some portion of what existed there did not disappear cleanly, did not vaporize with the changing of the maps, but dispersed, moved, carried knowledge westward and southward, and through the networks of trade and migration and imperial displacement that characterized the 19th century, eventually arrived in Chicago and Melbourne and São Paulo in the hands of craftsmen whose origins are recorded, if at all, as simply European. Because that's the word that appears in ledger after ledger when you look for the origins of the skilled workforce that built these buildings. European, not Polish or Ukrainian or Kazakh or Uzbek. European, a category so broad as to encompass everything and explain nothing. Let me return to the math of expertise, because this is where the official explanation doesn't just strain, it breaks. A master stonemason, someone capable of producing the quality of carved ornamental work that appears on the major civic and commercial buildings of the 1880s and 1890s, typically requires a minimum of 7 to 10 years of intensive apprenticeship before they can be trusted to work independently on complex decorative programs. That is the minimum. The finest work, the work that architectural historians point to when they want to illustrate the pinnacle of 19th century craft, that work requires craftsmen who have been at it for 20 years, whose hands know stone the way a musician's hands know an instrument, whose eye can read the grain of limestone before the chisel touches it and know how the material will behave under pressure. You cannot train those craftsmen in 5 years. You cannot train them in 10. The training pipeline for a master craftsman is a generation long. Now, in the 1880s, the United States is experiencing the largest construction boom in its history. Buildings are going up simultaneously in dozens of cities. The demand for skilled ornamental craftsmen is not just high, it is historically unprecedented. And yet the buildings get built, and yet the ornamental work gets executed, and yet the quality, by the testimony of the buildings themselves, which are still standing, is extraordinary. Where did the craftsmen come from? The standard answer is immigration. European immigrants, predominantly from Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe, brought their craft traditions to American shores. And yes, that is true. I believe that immigration was a real and significant source of skilled labor. The Italian stone carvers who worked on projects across the American Northeast are historically documented. The German metalworkers who established fabrication shops in Chicago and Cincinnati are real. This happened. But immigration from where, exactly? The ledgers say Europe. The immigration records, when they exist at all for working-class craftsmen in the 1880s, say Europe. But Europe is not a workshop. Europe is a continent. And the specific regions of Eastern Europe, from which the largest waves of skilled craft immigration came in the late 19th century, the borderlands between what is now Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the territories that had, until very recently on the maps, been labeled Tartaria, those regions are precisely the regions whose architectural and craft traditions are most poorly documented and most incompletely understood. Is that a coincidence? It might be. I want to be honest about that. It might be a coincidence produced by the general poverty of documentation for working-class craft traditions everywhere in the 19th century, combined with the eastward thinning of European record-keeping infrastructure as you move toward the Eurasian steppe. It might be that. Or it might be that the craftsmen who appeared in American and Australian and South American cities in the 1880s, carrying extraordinary skills for which no training pipeline can be clearly identified, carried those skills from a tradition that does not appear in the official record, because the tradition's homeland does not appear in the official record. What would that look like in the archive? It would look like exactly what we have. Let me talk about the buildings in a different way now. Let me talk about what they're made of, not aesthetically but physically, because the material question is as uncomfortable as the labor question. Steel, structural steel of the quality and quantity required to frame a 10, 15, 20-story building is not a product of cottage industry. It is a product of industrial-scale metallurgy. The Bessemer process, which made mass steel production economically viable, was patented in 1856. Carnegie Steel, which became the dominant supplier of structural steel for the Great American Building Programs, was only incorporated in 1892. Think about that timeline. The first skyscraper is built in 1885. Carnegie Steel, which will supply the material that makes most subsequent skyscrapers possible, does not exist as a corporate entity for another 7 years. The steel that frames the home insurance building has to come from somewhere. And the somewhere it comes from, the early American rolling mills operating in the late 1870s and early 1880s, were producing structural steel in quantities and to specifications that historical metallurgists have occasionally described as somewhat better than the contemporary state of the industry should have permitted. Somewhat better. That phrase appears in technical literature with enough frequency to be a pattern. The steel used in the Rookery building, analyzed structurally a century after its construction, exhibits characteristics that suggest either exceptionally skilled production for its era or raw material quality that the documented American steel industry of the 1880s wasn't quite supposed to be capable of producing yet. I am not suggesting the steel fell from the sky. What I am suggesting is that the official developmental narrative of American industrial metallurgy in the 1880s has gaps, and those gaps are not random. They are concentrated in precisely the period and precisely the product types that the great building programs required. Now extend the question globally. Melbourne, 1888. São Paulo, late 1880s. Cities that are not industrial powerhouses. Cities without major domestic steel production. Cities that should, by any straightforward logistics analysis, have been decades behind Chicago and New York in their capacity to build at scale. And yet they weren't. They built simultaneously. Not smaller, not simpler, simultaneously, at comparable scale, with comparable ornamental complexity. The structural steel for those buildings came from somewhere. The official record, when it addresses this at all, refers to import networks. British steel for the Australian colonies, European supply chains for South America, and yes, those networks existed. But the scale and speed at which they were deployed, the coordination they implied between suppliers and constructors on opposite sides of the planet in an era of slow communication, the assumption that the construction knowledge to use imported steel correctly was simultaneously present in Melbourne and Buenos Aires and Chicago. That coordination is one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the 19th century, and it receives almost no historical attention whatsoever. Almost none. Now I want to try something. I want to take the official explanation, the heroic industrial progress narrative, and apply it as rigorously as I can to a specific case, and see if it holds. The Bradbury Building in Los Angeles, 1893, 5 stories, a modest height by the standards of its contemporaries, but step inside and the modesty ends. A light court of such staggering beauty that it has appeared in more films than I can count, not because Hollywood decided it was a good backdrop, but because it represents something that the human eye recognizes immediately as exceptional. Ornamental iron galleries, glazed roof flooding the interior with Southern California light. Open cage elevators of elaborate cast iron filigree, the whole thing executed with a precision and intentionality that belongs to a mature tradition. The official story of the Bradbury Building is charming and somewhat improbable. Lewis Bradbury, a mining millionaire, hired an architect, Sumner Hunt, who was then replaced by a draftsman, Gardenier, who executed the final design based at least partially on descriptions from a science fiction novel, and possibly on a vision communicated through a Ouija board. The Ouija board element is almost certainly apocryphal, and I'm not citing it seriously. But the general shape of the story, that an inexperienced draftsman produced one of the most technically sophisticated and aesthetically coherent interiors of the 19th century, essentially by improvisation, that shape is the official story. And the ornamental ironwork, the ironwork that film directors and architectural historians have described as among the finest produced in 19th century America. That ironwork was fabricated by Mesca Brothers, a relatively small St. Louis firm, working from drawings produced by that same relatively inexperienced draftsman, executed by craftsmen whose specific identities, training histories, and workshop lineages are not meaningfully documented. Apply the official explanation: a small firm, an inexperienced designer, no documented craft tradition, produced ironwork that architectural conservators today describe as technically demanding and difficult to replicate. At what point does they just figured it out stop being an explanation and start being a placeholder for something we haven't investigated? Let me take you to a place the Tartaria conversation rarely goes, because the conversation usually stays in the Northern Hemisphere, in the familiar territory of European architectural traditions and American industrial ambition. But the pattern that interests me doesn't respect hemispheres. Buenos Aires, Argentina, the late 1880s through 1900s, a city that should not, by any straightforward developmental logic, be in possession of a built environment of the quality and scale that it has. Argentina's industrial base in 1890 is not comparable to Britain's or America's. Its population of skilled craftsmen cannot, by any reasonable estimate, have been trained domestically in sufficient numbers to account for what gets built, and yet the buildings are there. Avenue de Mayo, lined with facades of extraordinary classical and Baroque elaboration. The Teatro Colón, a concert hall whose acoustic and structural properties have been the subject of genuine admiration from engineers who have studied it. Buildings of a quality that implies, as it always implies, access to a tradition. The official explanation: European immigration, Italian immigrants especially. And yes, the Italian immigrant craftsman is a real historical figure in Buenos Aires, but Italian immigration to Argentina, at the scale that could account for the built environment of the 1890s, was not an established, multi-generational phenomenon by that point. It was itself a new phenomenon, the immigrants themselves recently arrived, their training recently acquired, their expertise at precisely the stage where they should be learning, not producing masterworks. Unless they arrived with the expertise already formed. Unless the immigration was not the origin of the skill, but the vehicle for the skill's transport. Unless somewhere in the territory from which those craftsmen ultimately came, through whatever chain of displacement, migration and remigration the 19th century produced, there existed a tradition of building knowledge old enough and deep enough to have produced masters before they ever boarded a ship. And if that's true, if the craft traditions that built Buenos Aires and Melbourne and Chicago arrived preformed, carried by people whose ultimate origin is not well documented, from a territory that is not well documented, during a period in which that territory was being systematically absorbed, and its administrative record consolidated into the archives of the empires that absorbed it, then the question of what we've been told versus what actually happened becomes very sharp indeed. I want to be precise about what the Tartaria question actually is, because it is almost always misframed. In the corners of the internet where it circulates most actively, it gets presented as a single, bold claim. Tartaria was a hidden empire, it built everything, and its existence was suppressed. That is a claim with a clean shape and zero credibility as stated, and its lack of credibility then becomes the reason to dismiss the underlying questions, which is exactly what should not happen. The underlying questions are real. Was there a sophisticated civilization, or network of civilizations, in the vast territory labeled Tartaria on pre-19th century maps? We don't fully know. The documentation is thin, and that thinness is itself a historical phenomenon requiring explanation. Why is the documentation thin? Partly because Western European historiography devoted limited resources to the study of Eurasian steppe civilizations, whose political structures didn't map neatly onto categories European historians were comfortable with. Partly because the absorption of those territories into Russian and Chinese imperial administration involved the reorganization of existing records within new bureaucratic frameworks that may not have preserved everything. And partly for reasons that are not fully established, and that it would be intellectually dishonest to pretend we understand. Is it possible that craft and engineering traditions developed in that territory spread westward and southward through the displacement and migration of the 18th and 19th centuries? Possible. The Silk Road had been a vector for the transmission of technical knowledge for 1,000 years before the 19th century. The specific routes by which glassmaking, papermaking, and textile techniques moved between Eurasia and Europe are well documented. The transmission of building knowledge along the same routes is less documented, but not less plausible. Is it possible that some portion of the workforce that executed the great building programs of the 1880s and 1890s, the carvers, the masons, the iron fabricators, the artisans whose expertise appears in the historical record without adequate explanation for its origins, carried knowledge that traces back to those traditions? I don't know, and I want to sit with not knowing, rather than reaching for a clean answer that the evidence doesn't actually support. But I know this: the not knowing is a historical problem. It is not a fact of nature. Knowledge doesn't vanish without leaving a trace of the vanishing. Skills don't appear from nowhere. Buildings of this quality and complexity and global simultaneity are not produced by improvisation. Something accounts for them. and whatever accounts for them, the official story doesn't fully account for them. That gap between what the evidence demands and what the official record provides, that gap is not a conspiracy. I am not using the word conspiracy. A conspiracy requires active coordination, requires people making decisions to suppress truth, requires a coherence of malicious intent that historical processes almost never actually have. What it might be instead is something more ordinary and more interesting. It might be the accumulated effect of a historiography that asked the wrong questions, that was organized around the achievements of architects rather than craftsmen, that treated the workers who executed these buildings as interchangeable labor rather than as bearers of irreplaceable knowledge, that was more interested in who designed the Rookery building than in where the hands that built it learned what they knew. That is not a conspiracy. That is a set of choices about what to record, what to ask, what to fund, what to publish, that have produced a record with specific and interesting holes. And those holes, taken together in their specificity, in their consistency, in the way they cluster around exactly the questions most awkward for the official progress narrative, those holes deserve examination. There is one more thing I want to say about the buildings themselves before I let you draw your own conclusions, because everything I've said about labor and materials and coordination and the Tartaria question is ultimately secondary to the buildings. The buildings are the primary evidence. They are the things that are actually there. Look at the terracotta. Terracotta, fired clay formed into architectural elements, is used on these buildings in a way that implies something extraordinary. It is not used decoratively, applied to a structural substrate as surface ornament. It is used structurally, integrated into the fabric of the building as an active component of its weather resistance, its fireproofing, its load distribution. The terracotta on the Wainwright building in St. Louis, completed 1891, performs structural functions that the architectural literature of the late 19th century was, according to official accounts, still working out theoretically. But the building was already built. The theory was still being developed. The practice preceded the theory by years. This happens repeatedly. The buildings are ahead of the literature. The construction precedes the formal engineering knowledge that is supposed to have made the construction possible. Structural steel framing systems are used in buildings years before the theoretical frameworks for calculating their behavior under load are published in engineering journals. Foundation systems adequate to support these structures are deployed in conditions where the soil science to design them confidently didn't yet exist. Practice precedes theory, application precedes understanding, construction happens before the knowledge to construct should have been available. There are two ways to interpret this. The first is that the builders were simply brilliant empiricists who worked ahead of their formal theoretical understanding through inspired trial and error, which, if true, should have produced a visible record of the error part of trial and error, which we have already established is conspicuously absent. The second is that the knowledge existed before the theory, because the knowledge came from somewhere other than the theoretical tradition we're examining. That it was practical knowledge, embodied knowledge, craft knowledge transmitted through hands and workshops rather than through journals and textbooks, and therefore did not produce a theoretical paper trail, only buildings. Buildings that are, as I said at the beginning, still standing. Impervious to revision, stubbornly, magnificently present, giving us their evidence whether we want it or not. So what happened, what actually happened? I don't have a clean answer. I am not going to pretend to have one. What I have is a shape that the evidence takes when you stop forcing it into the official narrative and let it organize itself around what it actually shows. The shape is this: sometime in the late 19th century, a reservoir of building knowledge, old knowledge, deep knowledge, knowledge whose roots go further back than the Industrial Revolution and possibly much further than we're comfortable acknowledging, entered the great building programs of that era. It entered through craftsmen whose origins are poorly documented, through material supply chains whose logistics are underdescribed, through a simultaneity of capability across disconnected global cities that the standard transmission narratives do not adequately explain. That knowledge built these buildings. It built them with a confidence and sophistication that only a mature tradition can produce. And then, across the first decades of the 20th century, it ended. Not evolved, not superseded in the way that better technologies supersede worse ones, with transition documents and handoff procedures and a record of the switchover. Ended. The ornamental traditions collapse in a generation. The craftsmen age and die and are not replaced. The buildings stop being built this way, and the knowledge of how to build them this way goes dark. The official story calls this modernism. It calls it a deliberate aesthetic choice, a rejection of historicism in favor of honesty about materials and structure, a rational response to the demands of the 20th century, and I believe that story has truth in it. The international style was a genuine intellectual movement with genuine intellectual content. But intellectual movements do not cause the extinction of craft traditions. They change what architects ask for. They do not eliminate the craftsmen who could still deliver something else if asked. The craftsmen who could carve those moldings and fabricate that ironwork and lay, that terracotta, were not persuaded by Le Corbusier to stop knowing what they knew. They died. They died without successors. And the question of why they died without successors, why the training pipeline that had somehow, against all historical logic, produced these craftsmen in such abundance in the 1880s and 1890s, was not maintained into the 20th century, that question receives almost no serious historical attention. Maybe the pipeline wasn't there to maintain. Maybe what appeared to be a robust training pipeline was actually the final generation of a much older tradition passing its knowledge forward, one last time into a historical moment that happened to be receptive, that happened to have the money and the ambition and the steel and the clients to make use of it. And when that final generation was gone, the knowledge was gone, because the tradition it came from had already been severed long before, severed when the territory that produced it was absorbed, renamed, its administrative records reorganized into someone else's imperial archives, its name fading from the maps. If that's what happened, and I want to be clear that I cannot prove that is what happened, only that it is consistent with the evidence in a way that the official story is not, then what we are looking at in Chicago and Melbourne and Buenos Aires is not the birth of a new tradition. It is the final, magnificent, heartbreaking performance of an old one. A civilization, or the ghost of a civilization, building its last buildings, carving its last capitals, raising its last steel, and then going silent. The silence is what I can't get past. Everywhere I look in the history of construction, there is noise. There is argument and failure and documented struggle, and the sound of things being figured out the hard way. The record of human beings learning to build is a record of people loudly and visibly not knowing what they're doing yet. Except here. Except in this specific period, in this specific tradition, in these specific buildings that stand on every continent, built in a window of 20 years, by craftsmen whose origins are obscure, using knowledge whose source is underdescribed, producing a quality that by every measure implies a tradition centuries deeper than the Industrial Revolution. The silence where the noise should be. The confidence where the uncertainty should be. The mastery where the apprenticeship should be visible. Look at these buildings, really look at them. The next time you walk past a 19th century facade, and you will because they are everywhere, because they survived, because whatever was built into them was built to last, actually stop. Tilt your head back, look at the cornice line, look at the carved stone. Look at the integration of structure and ornament, the way the building's bones and the building's skin are not two separate things but one continuous act of knowledge made physical. And ask yourself, does the story we have been given actually explain what you are looking at? Or does it merely name it? Because there is a difference between naming something and understanding it. And for these buildings, these impossible, magnificent, still standing buildings of the 19th century, we have been very good at naming them and very quiet about understanding them. The question of what we don't know is as large as the buildings themselves. Maybe larger. And the fact that nobody in the official record seems particularly troubled by that, nobody in the well-funded universities, nobody in the architectural history departments, nobody writing the textbooks that tell us the heroic march of progress explains everything, that absence of trouble, that comfortable institutional silence in the face of a mystery, this large and this visible and this still standing. That, more than anything else, is what keeps me looking.